Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to another Jane Austen July video. Today I'm going to be matchmaking Jane Austen novels with novels by Anthony Trollope. So I did a couple of these videos last year where I match-made Jane Austen novels with Emily Henry novels and then Elizabeth Gaskell novels, and I thought this year I would do it with Anthony Trollope novels and suggest to you some Anthony Trollope novels to try if you like particular novels by Jane Austen. I recently finished reading all 47 of Anthony Trollope's novels, and I have been making a lot of videos about him on this channel. He's one of my absolute favourite authors. I have been talking about Anthony Trollope quite a lot lately on this channel, and while I have paused my Trollope Thursday videos for Jane Austen July, I didn't think I could go a whole month without mentioning Anthony Trollope on this channel. So today we're going to matchmake some Jane Austen novels with Anthony Trollope novels. In general, I would say that Anthony Trollope is an author you are likely to like if you like the works of Jane Austen. He, like Jane Austen, is a very witty writer, but his books are very sort of comfy and cozy. Not always, like some of his books are quite dark, but in general Anthony Trollope's books do tend to be sort of big comfort reads for me in the same way that Jane Austen is for me. He has a wonderful but quite like clean, clear writing style like Jane Austen does, and he is very, very good at creating very realistic, interesting characters and kind of delving into character psychology, which is something else I think Jane Austen is interested in. And they both often write courtship novels and novels that sort of look at marriage and end in marriage, but there is also a lot of other things going on. So in general, I would highly recommend Anthony Trollope to you if you like Jane Austen. And it was interesting sort of trying to pair some of his books with some of her books, because on the one hand, I think you'll really like Anthony Trollope if you like Jane Austen, but on the other hand, I found some of these pairings quite hard to make, partly because Anthony Trollope wrote so many books, I suppose, and also because I sort of feel like I just want to recommend you all of Anthony Trollope if you like Jane Austen. But I have narrowed down one or two books to pair with each of Jane Austen's novels, and I'm going to go through them today. I should say, some of the Anthony Trollope novels I will be recommending today are from his 6-book series, The Barsetshire Chronicles. I highly, highly recommend reading The Barsetshire Chronicles in order. I will leave more links down below where I talk about those books in more detail. I am going to be recommending in this video some books from later in the series, but I highly recommend you read the rest of the series first. Right, so let's start off with Northanger Abbey, and I have two Anthony Trollope novels to recommend you if you like Northanger Abbey. They are both quite different, but I think they will appeal to different things you might like about Northanger Abbey. So the first is Rachel Ray, which is a sort of quieter, sweet love story about a young woman and man who meet each other and they like each other, but there are sort of family disapprovals and concerns about respectability and reputation. It is, at its heart, really a straightforward love story with obstacles. And to my mind, that is what Northanger Abbey is too. Obviously, it's also like a gothic pastiche, but in terms of the love story, it is a straightforward love story with obstacles, and the obstacles are often like family obstacles. And in that sense, I think Rachel Ray is quite a good pair to it. But I did want to also pair another book with Northanger Abbey to sort of bring out the gothic elements, and so I've gone for An Eye for an Eye, which is a really wonderful Anthony Trollope novel, one of his darker books, which is about a young man who is torn between sort of marrying the person that his family want him to marry and a woman he has fallen in love with in Ireland, but there is a sort of darkness hanging over this book. Obviously the title An Eye for an Eye implies that, and I feel like there is a little thread of sort of gothicness running through An Eye for an Eye, which maybe you'll like if you like Northanger Abbey. Next up is Sense and Sensibility, and here I feel on very firm ground because I have two recommendations for you if you love Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, and these are books that really very strongly make me think of Sense and Sensibility. We know that Anthony Trollope liked Jane Austen, and I do wonder if he really liked Sense and Sensibility because of how both these books really remind me of this novel. But anyway, so the first is The Small House at Allington, which is book 5 in the Barsetshire Chronicles, so I do highly recommend reading the first 4 books first. But this novel is incredible. It's probably my second favourite Anthony Trollope novel. I love it very, very much. And it is about two sisters, Belle and Lily Dale. Belle is more reserved, a bit quieter. Lily is sort of more emotional. Is that ringing any bells for you with sensibility? And we are following the romantic relationships of these sisters and the complications within those romantic relationships. And I just feel like these two books have so very much in common. You know, you have the bond between two sisters with very different personalities, but there's also some other things going on between these two books that put me in mind of each other. I feel like I'm going to spoil both if I say any more, but I highly recommend The Small House at Allington and The Whole Bassetts Chronicles if you love Sense and Sensibility. But I also wanted to recommend Isla's Angel by Anthony Trollope, which is a standalone, so you don't have to read the rest of the series before reading that. Isla's Angel tells the story of two sisters, Isla and Lucy, and what happens after they are left orphans and end up separated, sent to live with different relatives, and we follow their romantic relationships as well as their relationships with their family and the sort of new situations they find themselves in life. And Isla's Angel is an absolute favourite Anthony Trollope novel of mine. I think it's wonderful, really powerful, really lovely, like an absolute massive comfort read. I would say that, like, of all the books I'm recommending in this video, the book that I think you will love the most if you love Jane Austen is probably Isla's Angel. Like, I think it's the most Austen-esque. It's just marvellous fun and an utter delight in every way. And it has that sister relationship that you have in Sense and Sensibility, and also the sort of sisters adjusting to a new mode of life following the death of a parent. And I just can't recommend Isla's Angel enough if you love Jane Austen, but especially if you love Sense and Sensibility. Then next I picked a couple of recommendations for Pride and Prejudice. I found it a bit harder to choose books for Pride and Prejudice, I think partly because at the heart of Pride and Prejudice is that sort of bad first impressions, hate to love story. And I feel like Anthony Trollope doesn't have any, which seems ridiculous because he wrote 47 novels. There must be one in there somewhere, but I was looking through all the books and I couldn't really think of something that fitted that mould in terms of the love story. Exactly. But I have found a few books that I would like to recommend. So one is Dr. Thorne, which is book 3 in the Bassetts Chronicles. And I partly wanted to recommend this for Pride and Prejudice because I think it has a similar sort of status to Pride and Prejudice within Anthony Trollope's like canon, in that it is one of his most popular books. It is a very beloved novel, and like Pride and Prejudice, it is a love story. And like I said, many of Anthony Trollope's novels are love stories, but some of them are more love stories than others. Dr. Thorne, it tells the story of a young woman, Mary Thorne, living with her uncle. And there is a young man who lives in the neighbourhood called Frank Gresham. And him and Mary have, you know, a possible romantic connection. But Frank is being pushed by his family to marry money and to marry someone from a different social background to Mary Thorne. So I think Dr. Thorne has a lot of those sort of like class tensions that are really interesting in Pride and Prejudice, as well as being a love story and a sort of fan favourite, I suppose, if that makes sense. But I also wanted to recommend another Trollope novel, The Belton Estate, which I will be honest, I read quite a long time ago and my memory of it is not as fresh as I would like it to be. I really want to reread it because I loved it very much when I read it. But The Belton Estate is a really interesting novel about a woman sort of torn between two men, and land and class and money and inheritance kind of comes into the situation in really interesting ways. And I just have a feeling that it might be a novel you would like if you like Pride and Prejudice. But as I said, not quite as fresh in my mind as I would like it to be. So I feel like that is slightly vibes based, rather than like having a good coherent literary argument for the comparison. But anyway, let's move on to my next book. Next up is Mansfield Park, and I've just gone for one book recommendation for Mansfield Park, and that is Castle Richmond. Castle Richmond is a really interesting Anthony Trollope novel that put me in mind of Mansfield Park, partly because they are both novels that have a sort of love story on the surface that has importance to the plot, but actually they are about many other things. And they're also novels that are looking at sort of big social issues in the background of the novel. So for example, many people talk about the way in which sort of slavery and the slave trade plays a role in the sort of background of Mansfield Park. It is relatively in the background. I think it is less in the foreground than sometimes people say it is. But Castle Richmond does a sort of similar thing with the Great Hunger in Ireland in the 1840s. That is in the backdrop of Castle Richmond throughout every single moment of the novel. And although you're following characters dealing with other issues, that is very much always there. And I feel like if you find the way Mansfield Park looks at slavery interesting, I think you would find that a very interesting element of Castle Richmond. I also think Castle Richmond is a novel that is very, very complicated and rich in a way that I find Mansfield Park as well. Like, I feel like if I were to study an Anthony Trollope novel, I mean, first it would be The Way We Live Now, but like second it might be Castle Richmond. And I feel like Mansfield Park is, you know, my favourite sort of Jane Austen to study, I suppose. So that's another reason why I put those two together. Next up, some recommendations for Emma. The first Anthony Trollope novel that came to mind to me as something you should read if you like Emma is Barchester Towers. Now, Barchester Towers is the second book in the Barchester Chronicles, so I do highly recommend reading The Warden first. If I had ordered this video differently, I should have recommended this first and worked my way up through the series. But anyway, Barchester Towers, like Emma, is a sort of novel about, I want to say small towns, but Barchester is technically a city. It's a cathedral city, but it's a small place. And Highbury is maybe technically a village. I don't know. Anyway, these novels both in many ways look at small communities and the gossip and tension and scandal and like people being two-faced within small communities. I feel like that is a big thing these two novels have in common. Barchester Towers follows all the sort of like infighting and disputes, very polite disputes between the clergy in Barchester after a new bishop comes to town. And I just think it's a wonderful, really fun, witty, wry, excellent novel in every way that I think you will enjoy if you like Emma, because it has that same sense of wit, but also because it has that same sort of like look at all of the tensions within a small community, which is something I love very much about Emma. And I also wanted to recommend another book for Emma, which is The American Senator by Anthony Trollope. I will admit that The American Senator, like The Belton Estate, is an Anthony Trollope novel that I love a lot but haven't read for quite a while, and that is not as fresh as my mind as I would like it to be. So this is again a vibes-based recommendation. In my mind, The American Senator goes quite well with Emma. I think it might be partly to do with the main character and some of the traits that she has, but it might also be partly, again, to do with that sort of look at rural life and sort of small communities. At some point over the next few years, I will be rereading all of my favourite Anthony Trollope novels, especially those that I haven't read for sort of, you know, 6+ years. But yeah, I highly recommend The American Senator, and I think it pairs well with Emma. Next up, a recommendation for Persuasion by Jane Austen. If you love Persuasion, I would like to recommend you Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope. This is another Anthony Trollope novel that I think is a really like good one for Jane Austen fans. Like I think I said earlier that Isla's Angel would be like my #1 pick from Anthony Trollope's work for Jane Austen fans, but Miss Mackenzie will probably be my #2. Miss Mackenzie is a novel about a woman called Miss Mackenzie who is in her mid-30s. She spent most of her life sort of nursing her brother. She hasn't had many opportunities for a social life, for prospects of marriage and things like that. And then one day her brother passes away and she is suddenly left with quite a lot of money, and suddenly people want to marry her when no one wanted to marry her before. And I think Miss Mackenzie and Persuasion have in common that sort of like sense of loneliness, that sort of like slightly later on in life heroine, which I know sounds ridiculous when Anne Elliot is like 27 and Miss Mackenzie is probably my age. No, she's probably a little bit older than me, but not much older than me. But within the context of the 19th century and 19th century literature, the heroines of marriage plot novels are often women in their late teens, early 20s, and Miss Mackenzie has in common with Persuasion having a slightly older heroine at a slightly different stage in life, and who is also a sort of quiet, practical person, I suppose. I feel like Anne and Miss Mackenzie have some things in common. So yes, I would highly recommend Miss Mackenzie if you love Persuasion. Finally, I wanted to give you a recommendation for Lady Susan by Jane Austen. I feel like I haven't given a recommendation for Lady Susan in the matchmaking videos I've done in the past necessarily, but I wanted to do one today because I did think of a book that for me went quite well with Lady Susan, and that is Orley Farm. Lady Susan, if you don't know, is Jane Austen's epistolary novella. It's very short and very, very good fun, and has rather a scandalous heroine. And I thought of Orley Farm in connection with it because Orley Farm is a big sprawling novel with lots of characters, but there is one character in it who is unscrupulous in a way that reminds me of Lady Susan, though from very different motives and in a very different way. But there was just something about those figures that slightly reminded me of each other. And I'm not going to say too much more to avoid spoilers, but in my mind, Orley Farm pairs quite nicely with Lady Susan. So there we go. I hope this matchmaking exercise has been useful for you. Do please let me know if you've read any of these Anthony Trollope novels, what you thought of them, if you can think of any better pairings between Jane Austen novels and Anthony Trollope novels. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.